Every civilization, no matter how grand, leaves a trace, and yet most leave only echoes. Cities crumble, languages vanish, religions fade into oblivion, and the memory of kings dissolves under the weight of time. The earth reclaims the stone, and sand swallows the remnants of what once was. History, for the vast majority of human societies, follows a single, unyielding rule: rise, flourish, and ultimately disappear. And yet, there is one civilization that defied this pattern. Iran, the land we now know, whose people call it home, has weathered a storm of conquest and catastrophe that would have erased almost any other culture. For more than 2.5 millennia, this land has been invaded, occupied, and reshaped by Greeks, Arabs, Turks, and Mongols. Kings have fallen, capitals have burned, libraries have been lost, and entire dynasties vanished. Yet, the Persian language survived. The poetry of Rumi and Hafez, written under the shadow of foreign rule, became an enduring inheritance, shaping literature across the Islamic world. This resilience was not happenstance. Iran absorbed the currents of conquest, bending without breaking, transforming the faiths, languages, and cultures of invaders into something distinctly Persian. To understand this, we must first look at the land itself. The Iranian plateau rises like a fortress built by the earth. To the west, the Zagros Mountains form jagged barriers. To the north, the Alborz Range stretches in snow-capped arcs. To the east, vast deserts of salt and stone unfold. This elevated heartland spans over 1 million square miles, a land of extremes. Winters are merciless in the mountains. Summers scorch the lowlands into pale, cracked plains. Yet, along rivers and in hidden valleys, life clings stubbornly to survival. Water, scarce and precious, became the lifeblood around which early communities thrived. This geography was destiny. The plateau sits at the crossroads of the ancient world, bridging Mesopotamia to the west with Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent to the east. Civilizations passing through these corridors shaped, and were in turn shaped by, the people who called these highlands home. In the fertile lowlands near modern southwestern Iran, permanent settlements emerged as early as 3000 BCE. Here arose the Elamites, one of the ancient world's most sophisticated societies. Their capital, Susa, grew into a metropolis of temples, administrative complexes, and bustling marketplaces. The Elamites developed their own script, art, and political institutions, rivaling the contemporaneous civilizations of Sumer and Babylon. Susa itself endured for millennia, changing rulers but never disappearing, a city of remarkable continuity in a region defined by impermanence. By 1500 BCE, the Iranian plateau began to see the migration of Indo-Iranian peoples from the steppes of Central Asia. Known as Aryans, a term meaning noble, these semi-nomadic groups brought with them horses, distinctive pottery, and the sacred reverence for fire that would evolve into Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest living religions. Among them, 2 major groups settled distinct regions: the Medes in the northwest highlands near present-day Hamadan, and the Persians farther south in the lands of Parsa, later known to the Greeks as Persia. For centuries, these groups were tribal confederations, their societies built around kinship, cattle, and seasonal migration. To outsiders, Assyrians, Babylonians, and neighboring empires, they were peripheral, minor peoples of little consequence. Yet the mountains of the plateau had a memory, a way of nurturing extraordinary resilience. In the 8th century BCE, the Medes, scattered among highland clans and often subject to Assyrian tribute demands, experienced a transformation under a chieftain named Darius. Greek historian Herodotus describes him as brilliant and calculating, a man who understood that survival required unity. He first built his reputation as a fair and impartial judge, mediating disputes among fractious tribes. His fame spread, and then, in a bold political move, he withdrew his arbitration entirely. The tribes, unable to govern themselves, made him king. Darius's first act was the construction of a capital, Epatana, near modern Hamadan. Ancient sources describe concentric walls, each painted a different color, with the innermost ring glinting in silver and gold. Whether legend or fact, Epatana symbolized a center around which the Medes could unify, transforming a collection of clans into a kingdom. It was not Darius himself, but his grandsons who would transform this nascent kingdom into a military power capable of reshaping the Near East. Xerxes, a man of vision, reorganized the Median army into professional divisions: spearmen, cavalry, archers. The Medes became a force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, the Assyrian Empire, the terror of the ancient Near East, was weakening under internal strife and constant revolts. Xerxes seized this opportunity, forming an alliance with Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon through strategic marriage ties. Together, they turned against Assyria. In 612 BCE, the combined forces laid siege to Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. Walls that had seemed eternal fell, the city burned, and the Assyrian Empire, which had dominated for centuries, vanished in a storm of fire and chaos. The Medes claimed the northern and eastern territories, establishing a dominion stretching from Anatolia to Central Asia. Under their last great king, Ages, the Median Empire reached its peak, vast, wealthy, and seemingly unassailable. Yet within the heart of the empire, in the province of Parsa, a young Persian prince was growing up, Cyrus, second of his name. Cyrus observed the power and vulnerability of empire from the Median court, learning both the art of rule and the subtleties of weakness. Around 559 BCE, he became king of a Persian sub-kingdom within the Median sphere. For a time, he submitted to his overlords. Then he stopped waiting. By 550 BCE, Cyrus revolted. Unlike the catastrophic wars often imagined, the Median Empire collapsed from within. Nobles defected mid-campaign, armies dissolved, and the capital of Epatana simply changed hands. Cyrus absorbed rather than destroyed, maintaining Median customs and court structures. He understood a crucial truth. The machinery of empire is more valuable than the satisfaction of conquest. The stage was now set. Cyrus would extend Persian power further than any of his predecessors imagined. From this fertile, mountainous land, the story of a civilization that would resist conquest, absorb foreign influences, and endure across millennia was just beginning. The mountains of the Iranian plateau, with their cold winds and stark cliffs, had nurtured resilience and cunning in their people for centuries. It was a land of harsh winters and blistering summers. Yet from this environment emerged rulers who understood that power was not merely taken. It was cultivated, absorbed, and exercised with strategic precision. Among these rulers, none would shape the ancient Near East as profoundly as Cyrus II, known to history as Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was born around 600 BCE in Anshan, a city in the southern reaches of the Median realm, within a family that combined royal lineage and political acumen. His father, Cambyses I, was a minor Persian king, a vassal of the Medes. His mother, Mandane, was a daughter of the Median king Astyages, cementing the connection between two powerful but distinct peoples. From birth, Cyrus carried the blood of two dynasties, yet he would inherit neither fully. His destiny lay in forging something entirely new. Early legends surround his birth and youth. Greek historians like Herodotus recount omens, prophecies, and near-mythical adventures. A royal dream foretelling the overthrow of Astyages, the infant Cyrus abandoned, rescued, and raised in secret by shepherds. Symbols, perhaps, of his eventual rise from the margins of power to the center of history. Yet even these tales contain kernels of political truth. Cyrus was trained to observe the weaknesses of kings and the dynamics of loyalty, and he absorbed the lessons of the Median court like clay taking shape in a master potter's hands. By 559 BCE, Cyrus assumed the throne of Anshan. The Persian kingdom he inherited was modest compared to the sprawling Median Empire. yet he wielded it with vision. His early reign was marked by political shrewdness. Alliances were carefully negotiated, revolts were quelled with strategic force, and loyalty was rewarded with autonomy. Most importantly, Cyrus understood that the Medes, while rulers, were vulnerable, an empire held together by personal loyalty, not institutional strength. He observed Astyages carefully, learning how to exploit divisions among the Median nobility. The first major act of Cyrus's strategic genius came in the revolt against Median overlordship. Around 550 BCE, he began consolidating support among Persian clans dissatisfied with Median control. Some Median nobles, disenchanted with Astyages' rule, defected to Cyrus, seeing in him a leader who promised stability without the tyranny that had alienated them. The rebellion was swift. The Median army, demoralized and divided, failed to mount a coherent defense. Astyages himself was captured, and in an unprecedented act of political pragmatism, Cyrus spared his grandfather's life. He absorbed Median territories rather than destroying them, retaining their administrative systems and respected officials, thereby ensuring continuity while consolidating power. With the Medes subdued, Cyrus turned westward. The kingdom of Lydia, ruled by the famed King Croesus, was the next jewel to catch his ambition. Lydia, in what is now western Turkey, was rich and powerful, controlling vital trade routes and legendary for its wealth. Golden rivers, fertile plains, and a capital, Sardis, brimming with treasures. Croesus, confident in his resources and alliances, underestimated the speed and cunning of Cyrus. In 547 BCE, Cyrus crossed the Halys River, entering Lydian territory. The campaigns were swift and decisive, combining traditional Persian cavalry with strategic sieges and psychological warfare. Croesus attempted resistance, but the Persians, highly disciplined and adaptive, proved formidable. Sardis fell not merely through brute force, but through clever tactics, with accounts describing a Persian force scaling walls and exploiting weaknesses in the city's defenses. Croesus was captured but spared, a pattern that would define Cyrus's rule. Conquer, but respect local traditions and leaders, integrating them rather than annihilating them. Lydia's wealth was now at Cyrus's command, and his empire stretched from the Iranian plateau to the Aegean coast. Yet even Lydia was but a prelude. The greatest prize lay to the south, Babylon. By the mid-6th century BCE, Babylon was a city of immense renown. Its walls were legendary, its ziggurats reaching to the sky, and its riverbanks lined with gardens and palaces. The city had long been a symbol of Mesopotamian civilization, its kings rulers not only of land but of culture and religion. Nabonidus, the reigning monarch, was unpopular among his subjects, and the priesthood held great influence, resentful of royal neglect of the god Marduk. Cyrus, ever the master strategist, exploited these internal divisions. He presented himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator chosen by the gods to restore order. In 539 BCE, he advanced toward Babylon. The account of his conquest is legendary. Rather than engaging in prolonged siege, he diverted the Euphrates River, allowing troops to enter the city through its submerged canals. Babylon fell with astonishing swiftness and minimal bloodshed. Cyrus entered the city, not as a conqueror, but as a ruler respecting Babylonian traditions. He declared a general amnesty, restored temples, and allowed displaced peoples to return to their homes, a radical act in a world accustomed to scorched earth conquest. Among his most enduring acts was the issuing of what is now called the Cyrus Cylinder. This clay artifact, inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, proclaimed Cyrus's policies of religious tolerance and repatriation. Jews exiled in Babylon were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, earning Cyrus the title of a Messiah in later Jewish tradition. The cylinder was not mere propaganda. It reflected a philosophy that would underpin the Achaemenid Empire, centralized power with respect for local cultures, laws, and religions. In an age where conquest often meant extermination, Cyrus's approach was revolutionary. The unification of the Medes, Persians, and conquered lands laid the foundations of the Achaemenid Empire, stretching from the Indus River in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, encompassing vast linguistic, cultural, and geographic diversity. Yet the empire was not only territorial, it was administrative and ideological. Cyrus understood the challenges of governing diverse peoples and implemented a system of satrapies, regional governorships that allowed local leaders considerable autonomy while remaining accountable to the central authority. Royal inspectors, called the king's eyes and ears, ensured loyalty and compliance, a model that would be emulated by later empires. Cyrus's conquests were also transformative militarily. The Persian army, already formidable, incorporated cavalry, infantry, and chariots from conquered peoples, creating a composite force capable of operating across deserts, mountains, and rivers. Logistics, supply lines, and intelligence became as important as battlefield valor. Under Cyrus, the Achaemenid army became an instrument of both defense and projection of power, allowing rapid campaigns that could integrate distant territories before resistance could organize. By the end of Cyrus's reign, the Achaemenid Empire was the largest the world had yet seen, a mosaic of peoples, languages, and faiths held together not by fear alone, but by a careful balance of central authority and local autonomy. Yet, as vast as his achievements were, Cyrus's story was far from complete. His vision extended eastward to the Indus Valley, southward toward Egypt, and across the Mediterranean to the edges of the known world. Each campaign, each conquest, was not merely territorial expansion, but a deliberate weaving of civilizations into a new political and cultural order. Cyrus died around 530 BCE during a campaign in Central Asia, likely in battle against nomadic tribes. His death marked the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. The Achaemenid Empire, under his successors, would reach heights unimaginable in his lifetime. Yet it was Cyrus's philosophy, his synthesis of military genius and administrative foresight, that defined the empire's enduring character. The legacy of Cyrus the Great is not simply in the lands he conquered or the battles he won. It is in the idea of empire itself, a vision of rulership that combined power with pragmatism, conquest with cultural accommodation, and ambition with justice. It was a model that would influence rulers for centuries, from Alexander the Great to the Roman emperors and beyond. The mountains and deserts of Persia had produced not merely a king, but a paradigm for civilization, one capable of surviving centuries of upheaval, invasions, and change, yet always retaining its core identity. After Cyrus the Great passed away in the eastern steppes around 530 BC, the vast empire he had forged, the largest the world had ever known, stood at a precarious crossroads. His death left a vacuum that would test the very structures of power he had built. His son, Cambyses II, inherited the throne, stepping into the enormous shadow cast by his father's accomplishments. Cambyses was ambitious and determined, yet unprepared for the fragile balance of loyalty, intrigue, and unrest that underpinned an empire that stretched from the icy Anatolian highlands to the deserts beyond the Indus. Cambyses' first and most famous military action was the conquest of Egypt in 525 BC, marching across the Sinai. His armies faced not only the physical challenge of deserts and Nile floodplains, but also the political challenge of ruling a civilization that had endured for millennia, proud, and fiercely independent. The Egyptians were conquered, their pharaoh dethroned, and their wealth folded into the ever-growing Persian treasury. Cambyses, like his father before him, understood the power of spectacle and legitimacy. He positioned himself not simply as a conqueror, but as a ruler in the eyes of local priests, adopting rituals and honoring the gods of the Nile while asserting Persian authority. Yet even as he extended the empire westward, unrest simmered closer to home. The sudden death of Cambyses in 522 BC, under circumstances both mysterious and violent, unleashed chaos. A man named Galmeta, a magus claiming to be the secretly murdered brother of Cambyses, seized the throne. whether an impostor or a legitimate heir. Galmada's rule sparked fear among Persian nobles and military commanders. The empire, though vast and well-structured, was vulnerable to internal collapse when legitimacy itself was in question. Into this maelstrom stepped Darius, a young Achaemenid noble with a keen mind for strategy and an instinct for timing. Darius understood immediately that the empire's survival depended not only on military might, but also on perception, on convincing millions across multiple cultures and languages that his claim to the throne was just. With 6 co-conspirators, Darius assassinated Galmada and seized power, executing what would later be remembered as both a coup and a masterclass in political acumen. He knew that to secure his authority, words alone would not suffice. The story of his rise needed to be immortalized, and so it was carved in stone on a sheer cliff face at Behistun, visible to all travelers along the ancient road from Babylon to Ecbatana. The Behistun inscription, written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, was more than propaganda. It was a declaration of the new order. Darius is depicted standing triumphant, his foot upon the defeated Galmada, the gods themselves endorsing his rule. This monumental text communicated to distant satraps, local leaders, and foreign envoys alike that the empire remained intact, stable, and under divine guidance. Centuries later, it would serve as a Rosetta Stone for scholars decoding ancient scripts, but in Darius's time, it was a weapon of legitimacy. Once his authority was secure, Darius set about reshaping the empire's administration with unparalleled precision. He divided the vast territories into roughly 20 satrapies, each governed by a satrap responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and reporting directly to the king. To prevent corruption and rebellion, Darius instituted overlapping oversight. Military officers and royal inspectors reported independently, ensuring that no single satrap could amass power without checks. He built the Royal Road, a marvel stretching 1,700 miles from Sardis in the west to Susa in the heart of Persia. Mounted couriers, changing horses at stations along the way, could traverse this distance in just 7 days, a feat that amazed the ancient world. Communication that had once taken months could now occur in days. Commerce and standardization were equally critical. Darius introduced the daric, a gold coin bearing the king's image, and standardized weights and measures. Merchants in Anatolia and Bactria could now trade confidently, assured that their coins held uniform value. In tandem with these measures, Darius initiated construction of Persepolis, a ceremonial capital in the Persian homeland. Tens of thousands of workers labored under administrative oversight, erecting columned halls, grand terraces, and reliefs depicting delegations from every corner of the empire, a stone testament to unity and centralized authority. Yet for all the grandeur of the Persian heartland, tensions simmered at the edges. On the western coast, the Greek city-states of Ionia chafed under Persian rule. For decades, these city-states had been tolerated, ruled through local tyrants loyal to distant satraps. But by 499 BC, resentment erupted into revolt. The Ionian uprising, sparked in Miletus under Aristagoras, was modest in scale, yet fateful in consequence. Athens sent 20 ships in support, and when the Ionians burned Sardis, news reached Darius daily, each reminder stoking a relentless fury. Darius responded with measured force. His first expedition faltered against storms off Mount Athos, but 2 years later, a larger army of 25,000 men under Generals Datis and Artaphernes moved across the Aegean, subduing Eretria before marching on Marathon. There, in 490 BC, history recorded one of its most enduring confrontations. A smaller Greek force, defending ground of their choosing, charged at the Persian line. The disciplined hoplites folded the Persian flanks, forcing a retreat to the ships. Thousands of Persian soldiers perished. The Athenians lost fewer than 200. The distance run by a single messenger to announce the victory would give rise to the marathon race for millennia to come. Darius's death in 486 BC prevented immediate vengeance, and the task fell to his son Xerxes. Unlike his father, Xerxes pursued Greece with overwhelming scale. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a fleet bridging the Hellespont with floating pontoon bridges, moving inexorably toward the heart of Europe. At Thermopylae in 480 BC, 300 Spartans under King Leonidas held the pass for 3 days before betrayal allowed Persian passage. Xerxes razed Athens, yet at Salamis, Greek naval strategy crushed the massive Persian fleet, and Plataea in 479 BC finished the campaign. Persia had failed to subjugate Greece, but the empire itself endured, vast and resilient, tempered by experience and necessity. Inside the empire, life continued with astonishing complexity. The court at Persepolis remained a dense web of ritual, ambition, and intrigue. Royal women like Amestris and Persidas wielded influence quietly yet decisively, shaping succession, alliances, and the administration of the realm. Across the provinces, satraps controlled armies and wealth, sometimes rebelling, yet the system's design, flexible, multi-layered, and rooted in tradition, ensured the empire's survival. Zoroastrianism underpinned cultural cohesion, offering a shared spiritual framework. Ahura Mazda as the wise lord of truth and light, Ahriman as the destructive spirit of chaos. Persian kings presented themselves as agents of order in this cosmic struggle, linking governance with divine will. By the 4th century BC, the empire had endured rebellions, revolts, and foreign threats. Figures like Artaxerxes III reconsolidated power temporarily, but the pressure of internal factionalism and external challengers persisted. The stage was set for the next seismic shift. A young Macedonian general named Alexander, educated by Aristotle and hardened by the battlefield genius of Philip II, would arrive from the west, challenging the resilience of Persia itself. Yet even as empires rose and fell, one pattern endured. The Persian system, language, religion, and identity survived, absorbing conquerors, enduring shocks, and emerging defiantly Iranian across centuries. The stage was set, the threads of history taut with tension, and the story of Persia's encounter with Alexander would soon unfold. A tale of conquest, adaptation, and resilience that would echo through the ages. The death of Xerxes after the Persian-Greek Wars marked not the end of the Achaemenid Empire, but the beginning of a chapter that would test the very limits of imperial resilience. Persia was vast, diverse, and rich beyond measure. Yet it was a mosaic of cultures and peoples, bound together not only by centralized authority, but by a tradition of absorption, adaptation, and accommodation. The administrations of Darius and Xerxes had learned to govern this myriad of lands through satrapies, roads, standardized coinage, and religious respect. But for all its sophistication, a new challenge approached from the west, one unlike any this ancient civilization had faced before. In the rugged hills of Macedon, a young king named Alexander, son of Philip II and tutored by Aristotle, matured in ambition and military strategy. He was a man of remarkable intellect and boundless energy, consumed by the idea not merely of raiding Persia's riches, but of conquering its very soul. In 334 BCE, at the age of 22, he crossed the Hellespont with perhaps 40,000 men, an army lean by Persian standards but disciplined, cohesive, and united by a single purpose: to overthrow the Asian dominion and claim its legacy. What followed was one of the most dramatic military campaigns in human history. At the Granicus River in northern Anatolia, Alexander's cavalry charge shattered Persian defenses, sending shockwaves through the satrapies. City after city surrendered or fell, often without protracted resistance, for the speed and decisiveness of Alexander's strategy defied expectation. Persian satraps realized they faced not merely an invading army, but a commander who combined tactical innovation with psychological warfare. In 333 BCE, at the Battle of Issus, Alexander faced Darius III himself. The dusty plains south of modern-day Turkey became the stage for an encounter that would define a civilization's future. Alexander's companions, his elite cavalry arranged in oblique formations, pierced the Persian left flank, driving panic through the massive army commanded by Darius. The Persian king fled the field, leaving behind his family, his mother, his wife, and his daughters, who were taken into Alexander's custody. Though he was their conqueror, Alexander treated them with dignity and respect, a calculated gesture that spoke of both political astuteness and personal reputation. The campaign pressed on through the heart of Mesopotamia. In 331 BCE, at Gaugamela, Alexander met Darius once again. Preparing for the engagement, Darius had leveled the terrain to maximize the effectiveness of his war chariots and massed troops, high in number and expectation. Yet Alexander's forces, smaller but more maneuverable and coordinated, executed an oblique assault that broke the Persian center and forced another retreat. Darius vanished into the endless plains, pursued by a momentum that signaled the swift implosion of the greatest empire the world had seen. The cities of Babylon and Susa capitulated. Their treasures, amassed over centuries, were now in Alexander's hands. Yet he understood that conquest alone was not governance. In Babylon, he honored local customs, partook in sacred rites, and positioned himself as heir to the legacy of kings who had once stood there. The citadel that Cyrus had captured nearly 2 centuries earlier was now a station of Alexander's command. The empire of Persia had fallen, yet its administrative genius and cultural achievements did not vanish. They were absorbed and transformed. Soon came Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian imperial culture. The terraces, columns, and grand halls, symbols of Achaemenid unity and majesty, stood before Alexander like an offering and an accusation. Whether by deliberate revenge, symbolic settling of accounts, or drunken accident, the great palaces burned. Ancient sources give conflicting accounts. One tradition holds that Alexander ordered the destruction to avenge Persian assaults on Greek temples centuries before, another that a banquet celebration ignited the conflagration. Whatever the cause, the result was devastating. Centuries of wealth and heritage consumed in flames, their ashes scattered by desert winds. Yet, even in destruction, there was transformation. Alexander did not repudiate Persia's legacy. He sought to fuse it with his own vision. He adopted Persian court dress, integrated Persian nobles into his administration, and encouraged his Macedonian officers to accept Persian wives. This cultural synthesis was radical, controversial, and uneasy. Macedonian veterans balked at being asked to prostrate themselves, a tradition of Persian royal homage known as proskynesis before their new monarch. To the Greeks, such reverence was reserved for gods, not men. Tension rippled through the ranks, threatening to fracture the unity Alexander had forged through battle. In 327 BCE, Alexander married Roxana, a Bactrian princess from the fertile regions of Central Asia, solidifying his alliance with Iranian elites. He also married Statira, daughter of Darius III, and encouraged his officers to follow his example, uniting Macedonian and Persian bloodlines in a deliberate political act. He was not merely conquering Iran. He was attempting to become its king in the truest sense, fusing 2 civilizations into a hybrid dynasty that spanned continents. Yet this grand experiment would not survive Alexander's own life. In 323 BCE, in the city of Babylon, a fitting center for the final act of his reign, Alexander died unexpectedly, succumbing to fever at the age of 32. His death left no clear successor. Within hours, the argument over the division of his empire began. His generals, known as the Diadochi, the successors, would spend the next 4 decades tearing apart his conquests in a cycle of alliances, betrayals, and wars that reshaped the ancient world. In Iran and the broader Near East, the vacuum left by Alexander birthed a succession of Hellenistic dynasties. The most influential among them was the Seleucid Empire, founded by Seleucus after his campaigns secured Babylon and extended control eastward. The Seleucids represented an era in which Greek culture, language, and civic institutions spread across territories once ruled by Persia, their cities bedecked with Greek names, theaters, and agoras, symbols of a new cultural horizon. Large cities like Seleucia on the Tigris grew into urban centers rivaling Alexandria itself. Greek became the language of administration and scholarship. Coins bore Hellenistic images. Philosophical schools and gymnasiums dotted the landscape. Currency, bureaucracy, and civic life were now infused with Greek cosmopolitanism in ways that previous Persian regimes would have neither imagined nor prioritized. Marriage festivals and athletic competitions followed patterns of Greek tradition. Statues of philosophers and gods were erected alongside temples that centuries earlier had echoed only with Zoroastrian incantations. Even as Greek elites settled into positions of power, an undercurrent of Persian tradition pulsed deeply through the countryside, villager by villager, language by language. Walk beyond the city walls, and the world was different. In remote villages and mountain hamlets, ancient Iranian languages persisted. Zoroastrian fire temples, tended by priests whose rituals stretched back through generations untouched by Hellenistic redesign, continued to burn without interruption. Local leaders often retained informal authority, administering land and customs that had long predated the arrival of Alexander's cavalry. This synthesis, Greek and Iranian, administration and tradition, reached its limits as the Seleucid Empire struggled to govern its immense territories. From the Aegean to Central Asia, governance proved tenuous. Wars with rival Hellenistic states, pressures from rising powers in the West, and revolts in the East sapped Seleucid strength. The constant movement of armies and the diffusion of authority made coherent governance increasingly difficult. Amid this fracturing, a new power rose in the northeastern reaches of the plateau. In the rugged region known to Greek chroniclers as Parthia, nomadic Iranian tribes called the Parni had maintained traditions of mobility, horsemanship, and martial skill. These qualities became decisive in moments when empires faltered. Around 247 BCE, a chieftain named Xerxes led his followers to seize control of Parthia from its Seleucid governor. Xerxes' act was bold, almost reckless by conventional standards. No palace, no treasury, no grand army. Only momentum, loyalty, and timing. Yet it was enough. From this moment, the Arsacid dynasty began its ascent, taking its name as a royal title that successive kings would bear, blurring individual identity into legend and mythology. For nearly a century after Xerxes' rise, the Parthian kingdom remained a regional power, cautious and consolidating. But in 171 BCE, Mithridates I ascended the throne and revealed a strategy that would distinguish Parthian rule. He looked at the vast but hollow shell of the Seleucid Empire and understood that decline was not a catastrophe but an opportunity. His campaigns swept westward and southward with calculated aggression. Media fell within years, followed by the monumental prize of Mesopotamia around 141 BC, lands of ancient cities, vast wealth, and strategic advantage. When Mithridates captured the Seleucid king Demetrius II in battle, it struck a symbolic blow. A nomadic Iranian dynasty had humbled the heirs of Alexander the Great. It was no small feat, yet the Parthians did not simply replicate the administrative systems of Achaemenid Persia or of the Seleucids. They did something distinct, something that would characterize their millennium of rule: adaptability. While Greek remained in official contexts, on coins, in certain formal inscriptions, and while Parthian nobles sometimes bore Hellenistic names and collected Greek art with genuine appreciation, the underlying structure of Parthian governance was unlike either prior Persian Empire or Greek state. The Arsacid realm operated through a feudal network of powerful noble houses. Families like the Serena and the Karen controlled vast estates and furnished the heavy cavalry that formed the backbone of Parthian military power. These nobles were not mere subjects. They were partners, proud of traditions predating Arsacid rule, capable of making and unmaking kings when royal authority weakened. This arrangement gave the empire enormous flexibility and resilience. but also created a persistent vulnerability. The very noble houses that could mobilize cavalry for royal campaigns could, under different conditions, act independently, resisting central command. The empire's cohesion depended not on rigid bureaucracy, but on negotiated loyalty and shared aristocratic identity. Architecture and urban life flourished under Parthian patronage. The city of Ctesiphon on the Tigris grew into a magnificent capital, its halls reflecting both Hellenistic influence and distinct Iranian aesthetics. The Parthian Iwan, a vaulted hall open at one end, appeared in palaces and public buildings, laying the groundwork for architectural forms that would later define Iranian sacred space under centuries of Islamic rule. By the mid-1st century BCE, this hybrid empire stretched from the Euphrates to eastern Iran, and its western frontier came into direct collision with the rising power of Rome. The Romans arrived with absolute confidence. Their legions hailed as the finest infantry in the world. In 53 BCE, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthy triumvir seeking military glory, marched 7 Roman legions across the Euphrates into Parthian territory. What followed was one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. The Parthian commander, known simply as Surina, employed mobile cavalry equipped with composite bows, refusing direct engagement and instead striking in waves that exhausted the disciplined but vulnerable Roman formations. The desert between the Euphrates and the town of Caere was perfect terrain for Parthian tactics. Roman infantry, designed for close-quartered battle on gentle terrain, struggled against the swirling horse archers. Camel packs moved behind the Parthian line supplying fresh arrows. The Romans were overwhelmed. Crassus himself was killed during negotiations, his severed head reportedly presented at the Parthian court as an emblem of victory. Around 20,000 Roman soldiers died, 10,000 were captured, a disaster that haunted Roman consciousness for centuries. The Parthian triumph endured not just through military success, but through diplomacy. The captured Roman standards became a monument of humiliation in Parthian temples until Augustus negotiated their return in 20 BC, a symbolic restoration of Roman honor without battlefield conflict. Other campaigns, like Marcus Antonius's ill-fated invasion in 36 BC, met similar frustration, proving that Parthian cavalry and feudal resilience could counter even Rome's might. For 2 centuries, these confrontations settled into a grinding rhythm of raids, counter-raids, and negotiated truces with Armenia, often serving as a buffer state. Neither empire achieved a decisive blow. The Romans excelled in siege warfare and pitched battles on terrain of their choosing. The Parthians dominated mobility, endurance, and strategic flexibility. The Euphrates became not merely a river, but a boundary between competing civilizations whose clashes shaped the geopolitics of the ancient world. The Parthian ruling model, feudal yet flexible, aristocratic yet adaptive, persisted for centuries. It was not a centralized empire like the Achaemenids, nor a rigid monarchy like the Seleucids. Instead, it was a network of power, shared and contested, woven into the fabric of Iranian highland culture. The old traditions of land stewardship, cavalry mastery, and noble autonomy continued to hold sway even as Greek language and tokens lingered in courtly circles. Amid these grand political currents, cultural life flourished. Art from the period, bronze sculptures, ceremonial vessels, and relief carvings, reveals a civilization comfortable in 2 worlds simultaneously. Greek and aesthetic influence, yet rooted in Iranian motifs and spiritual traditions. Religious plurality endured. Zoroastrian fire temples remained active, their priests maintaining rites that connected future generations across eras of conquest and foreign rule. The story of Parthian resilience, of aristocratic negotiation, and of cultural synthesis flowed forward for centuries, binding eastern Iran to the broader world. Rome tested the Parthians repeatedly, yet neither empire vanquished the other outright. The ebb and flow of conflict across desert plains and river valleys shaped borders not simply on maps, but in collective memory. And as centuries passed, Another transformation lay on the horizon, one that would not come from the west or through conquest alone, but from within Iran itself. A return to centralized authority and a reinvention of imperial power rooted in Iranian identity. The next chapter, the rise of the Sasanian Empire, would not merely reshape Iran but the entire Near East, setting the stage for a civilization about to face an even more profound transformation. The sun rose over the broad plains of Persia in the spring of 224 CE, as it had for centuries, across lands where history had repeatedly churned fortunes and overturned kings. From the fertile valleys to the arid highlands, the legacy of the Achaemenid, Seleucid, and Parthian empires was written in ruined fortresses, splintered statues, and old legends whose echoes still filled the bazaars and fire temples of the plateau. Yet even as tradition endured, the political landscape awaited transformation. The time had come for a new dynasty, one that would not merely govern Persia, but reforge the idea of Persian kingship itself. In the southwestern region of Persia, in the ancient heartland of Fars where Cyrus and Darius had once walked, a chieftain named Ardashir rose from relative obscurity, son of Papak and grandson of a Zoroastrian priest named Sazin. Ardashir was a man driven by ambition, political cunning, and a vision that surpassed the petty squabbles of Parthian noble houses. While Parthian rule endured through a loose feudal structure of powerful families, the Surinas, the Karans, and others whose names carried prestige more than centralized authority, Ardashir maneuvered with a ruthlessness that few could match. The Parthian system had proven flexible and resilient for centuries, its feudal nobles adept at maintaining local power and autonomous administration. Yet it lacked the centralized command necessary to respond cohesively when crisis erupted. In 224 CE, on the plains near the river Hormuz, a decisive confrontation occurred that would determine the region's centuries to come. Ardashir's forces met those of the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV, in a battle that pulverized the already weakened noble confederation. Artabanus fell on the field, and with him the Arsacid dynasty that had stood for nearly 5 centuries. In that moment, the Sasanian Empire was born. Ardashir's vision was deliberately different from the Parthian way, where the Arsacids had governed through a network of semi-independent nobles. The Sasanians pursued unity under a singular, divinely sanctioned monarch. The title they chose, Shahanshah, King of Kings, harkened back to the Achaemenid age, but now it was infused with a sacred meaning. The Sasanian monarch was not merely a temporal ruler. In Sasanian ideology, he was the earthly representative of cosmic order itself, the agent of Asha, the Zoroastrian concept of truth and divine justice. Religion became the sinew that bound the new state together. Zoroastrianism, though never extinct under Parthian rule, now achieved its most organized and powerful institutional expression. The priestly caste, known as the Magi, rose to prominence, forming a hierarchy under a chief priest whose authority was second only to the king. Sacred fires, long tended in isolated temples and local communities, now became symbols of state power and cohesion. Orthodoxy was defined. Sacred texts were compiled, codified, and interpreted under royal patronage. Religious festivals, rituals, and iconography were standardized across the empire, weaving cultural unity out of Persia's vast diversity. Yet Ardashir was more than a religious reformer. He was a conqueror in the old tradition, extending his control beyond the plateau into neighboring regions. His son and successor, Shapur I, furthered the campaign with astonishing vigor. Shapur did not merely inherit his father's throne. He inherited a vision of Persia not as a regional player, but as a world power whose influence reached beyond the Zagros and Alborz mountains. The Roman Empire to the west was the great rival of this new Persian order. For centuries, Rome had grown from a city-state to a Mediterranean superpower, its legions unbeaten in pitched battle, its administrative acumen legendary. Yet Shapur I saw not an insurmountable obstacle, but a worthy adversary whose confrontation would define his reign. In 260 CE, at the Battle of Edessa, the Persian and Roman forces clashed in what would become one of the most consequential encounters of the ancient world. The Roman Emperor Valerian made a fatal decision to engage Shapur directly. The battle that followed ended in disaster for Rome. Valerian was captured alive, the only Roman emperor in history taken prisoner in such a manner. Shapur commemorated this victory not merely in words but in stone. At Nakshi Rustum, an ancient cliff near the ruins of Persepolis where past kings were immortalized, he ordered colossal carvings showing himself on horseback, triumphant, with Roman emperors depicted in submission at his feet. These reliefs were more than propaganda. They were statements of ideology, visual affirmations of Persian supremacy that would endure for centuries. Persia had humbled Rome, or so the reliefs declared, and the message carried far beyond the desert sands. Yet the Sasanian state was not solely defined by war. Under its early rulers, Persia saw a flowering of culture, intellectual vibrancy, and artistic achievement. Zoroastrian religious thought evolved alongside state structures, providing a spiritual grammar for Persian identity that intertwined with politics and law. The class of magi became not only guardians of sacred fire, but advisors to the throne, interpreters of law, and custodians of education. Fire temples, each tended with ritual precision, became centers of community and religion, binding local identity to imperial ideology. Still, not everyone within the empire shared a uniform vision. The 3rd century also produced one of antiquity's most remarkable religious thinkers, a prophet named Mani. Mani's innovative faith, Manichaeism, blended elements of Zoroastrian dualism with Christian and Buddhist influences. It spread rapidly across the empire and beyond, attracting followers from every class and region. At first tolerated, Mani and his teachings later came under suspicion by traditional Zoroastrian priests and eventually faced suppression. The tension between spiritual innovation and orthodoxy, between syncretism and tradition, became one of the religious dynamics of the time. Despite internal diversity, the Sasanian state continued to expand and consolidate. Shapur's successors maintained ambitious foreign policies, particularly against Rome. Under successive emperors, Persia and Rome engaged in decades of fierce contests over control of Mesopotamia, Syria, Armenia, and the rich trade corridors of the Near East. These wars stretched the treasury and tested the durability of Sasanian institutions. Yet even as conflict persisted, the administrative and military reforms initiated by Ardashir and enhanced by Shapur ensured that Persia remained cohesive and purposeful. By the 4th century CE, the foundations of Sasanian imperial power were firmly laid. What followed was something rarer in the ancient world, an empire that did not merely expand, but genuinely flourished. It produced statesmen, bureaucrats, scholars, and theologians. It harnessed the power of centralized authority without entirely subsuming local identities, allowing a vibrant civil society to bloom under imperial patronage. No ruler better exemplified this high point than Khosrow I, Anushirvan, the one with the immortal soul, who reigned from 531 to 579 CE. Khosrow understood that the strength of an empire lies not only in fields of battle, but in its internal cohesion and prosperity. He embarked upon sweeping administrative reforms that revitalized taxation, standardized land surveys, and replaced arbitrary assessments with fixed rates based on soil quality and crop type. For peasants and landowners alike, this predictability was revolutionary in a world accustomed to feudal whim and arbitrary exactions. Under Khosrow, Persia's social structure became formally codified into 4 classes: priests, warriors, scribes, and commoners. This rigid hierarchy assigned roles, privileges, and duties to each group, reinforcing social order even as it imposed constraints that could be harsh by modern standards. Legal systems were refined, courts were formalized, and bureaucracy became more sophisticated, allowing the empire's sprawling affairs to be managed with an impressive degree of efficiency. Yet Khosrow's most enduring legacy may have been intellectual rather than administrative. The Academy of Gunshaper, located in southwestern Persia, emerged under his patronage as one of the most important centers of learning in the ancient world. When the Byzantine Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools of Athens in 529 CE, scholars of Greek philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy sought refuge in the East. Gunshaper welcomed them, creating a synthesis of knowledge that brought together Greek physicians, Indian mathematicians, Syrian translators, and Persian astronomers under one roof. The academy became a crucible for innovation, advances in medicine, mathematics, and translation that would ripple across continents and centuries. Across the empire, Persian artisans produced textiles, metalwork, and ceremonial art of breathtaking complexity. Silks woven with hunting scenes and mythological figures were traded as far as China and Constantinople. Silver bowls depicting royal hunts set artistic standards that would influence craftsmen well into the future. Indeed, when Islamic artisans of the 7th and 8th centuries sought visual models, they instinctively drew upon Sasanian forms, perpetuating a cultural vocabulary that was at once Persian and universal. Culturally, Persia was not insular. It absorbed and reinvented. The game of chess, brought from India, was refined at the Sasanian court into the strategic form known across the world today. Polo, fiercely competitive and physically demanding, blurred the line between sport and military training, a reflection of Persian values that linked athletic prowess with martial readiness. These cultural transmissions traveled westward along trade routes, carrying Persian prestige and identity with them. But no golden age exists without conflict, and Khosrow's reign was no exception. Wars with the Byzantine Empire raged with unrelenting ferocity as both powers contested control of strategic territories. Mesopotamia, Syria, Armenia, and the rich trade routes of the Near East became perpetual battlegrounds. The wars were inconclusive yet exhaustive, draining manpower and wealth from both empires across generations. Despite administrative brilliance and cultural vitality, the Sasanian state, like all empires, was vulnerable to the wear of prolonged warfare. Its zenith under Khosrow I was magnificent. Yet just as his reforms solidified Persia's strength, they also created rigid structures that could not easily adapt to the stresses that followed. By the early 7th century, under Khosrow II, the empire appeared to vindicate every claim of Persian greatness. Sasanian armies achieved remarkable victories. Jerusalem fell, Egypt was conquered, and Byzantine forces were pushed back toward Constantinople itself. For a decade, it seemed that Persia had finally secured dominion over the ancient Near East. Yet what followed was a catastrophic overreach, one that weakened both Persia and Byzantium and set the stage for an unprecedented challenge no empire had ever faced. The armies massing on the Arabian Peninsula were not considered a serious threat by either Persia or Byzantium. Yet from those desert tribes emerged a movement whose impact would reach far beyond the scorched sands. The subsequent battles would not merely end the Sasanian Empire. They would transform Iran so completely that future generations would look back at every preceding dynasty, Median, Achaemenid, Parthian, Sasanian, through an entirely new lens. Signs of collapse did not emerge gradually. They erupted all at once. By 628 CE, after decades of exhausting war with Byzantium, the Sasanian Empire that had seemed unassailable was weakened beyond measure. Khosrow II himself was overthrown and killed. In the 4 years that followed, no fewer than 8 rulers claimed the Persian throne in rapid succession. Generals murdered kings. Court factions poisoned pretenders. The treasury was emptied, the army fragmented, and the bureaucracy that had bound Persia together for centuries ground toward paralysis. Into this vacuum came a phenomenon unseen in the ancient world, a revolutionary religious and political movement that would not simply topple an empire, but reshape the entire structure of civilization. Rising from the deserts of Arabia, tribes unified under a single prophet and a message of monotheism, community, and spiritual conviction. a movement that would unleash forces both spiritual and military across the ancient world in ways that would change it forever. The Sasanian Empire, which had stood as the most formidable Iranian power in history, was about to face not merely conquest but transformation, a metamorphosis of religious, cultural, and political life that would echo for centuries. The year was 629 CE. The Sasanian Empire, once the unassailable monarch of the Near East, was unraveling as if the very threads of state had been cut one by one. The long wars with Byzantium had bled wealth, fractured authority, and hollowed out the administrative might that kings like Khosrow I had built with such painstaking genius. Courtiers murdered kings. Generals raised pretenders. The proud armies that had defeated Roman emperors now fragmented, their loyalty divided among feuding nobles in the capital, Ctesiphon. And in the south, beyond the imperial roads and fertile fields, a new force was stirring. One whose strength would not be measured by chariots, catapults, or palaces, but by conviction, unity, and an idea that would sweep across continents. From the desert lands of the Arabian Peninsula, among nomadic tribes long considered a peripheral concern of great empires, rose a prophet whose message would sweep away centuries of political order and reshape the religious and cultural landscape of Iran forever. His name was Muhammad. He preached a message that was at once simple and revolutionary, that there is no God but Allah, and that all men and women are equal before him. In a region fragmented by lineage and tribal allegiance, this message forged a new sense of community. Ummah, one based not on blood but belief. Muhammad died in 632 CE, but his followers, unified and disciplined, began what would become one of the most rapid and transformative conquests in human history. They were not an army forged by years of imperial drill. They were farmers, merchants, and Bedouins carrying the conviction that their cause was divine. Their weapons were swords and spears. Their armor was faith. The Sasanian state, already hollowed by internal collapse, proved unable to repel the onslaught. In 633 CE, Muslim forces crossed into Persian territory, defeating a Sasanian army at the Battle of the Bridge. Then came the decisive clash at Al-Qadisiyah in 636 CE, where the Arab forces, inspired by unity and guided by determined commanders, routed the Persians despite being heavily outnumbered. The Persian ruler, Yazdijerd III, fled eastward, never to recover his throne. The road to Ctesiphon, the imperial capital, lay open. Arab armies marched upon it with astonishing speed. They crossed the Tigris, laid siege to the great city, and soon its walls fell. For the first time in more than a millennium, Iran's ancient centers of power, the same cities that had witnessed the rise of Medes, Achaemenids, Parthians, and Sasanians, came under the authority of a new political order informed by Islam. Baghdad would later rise not far from these ruins, but the symbolism of Ctesiphon's fall was unmistakable. An ancient world had passed, and a new one was ascending. The conquest was not merely military, it was transformative. The Arabs did not simply replace kings and satraps. They introduced a new religious and legal framework that would reshape the very identity of the region. Zoroastrian fire temples that for centuries had burned against the backdrop of mountain and plain saw their congregations dwindle. Some fire temples remained, others were abandoned. Persian priests, custodians of ancient rites, found their roles diminished under an Islamic regime that commanded not only political authority, but moral and cosmic legitimacy. Yet the transformation would not be one of total erasure. Instead, the roots of Persian culture proved too deep, too resilient, and too adaptable. Language, custom, and intellectual heritage persisted, even as the structure of governance and religion underwent fundamental change. The early Islamic period witnessed the emergence of Persia as a vital and dynamic part of the new Islamic civilization. Iran was no longer a unified empire under a Persian king. It was now a collection of provinces under the rule of the Caliphate, first under the Rashidun, then the Umayyads, and later the Abbasids. The Arab conquerors brought their language, law, and religious traditions, but they did not, and could not, simply erased centuries of Persian history embedded in the land and its people. Persians entered the service of the new Islamic State, bringing with them administrative expertise honed under the Sasanians. Their talents in taxation, record-keeping, diplomacy, and governance became invaluable to the caliphs who sought to govern an empire stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic. The administrative offices in Basra, Kufa, Damascus, and ultimately Baghdad included Persian scribes and scholars whose knowledge of languages, law, and culture became indispensable. It was in Baghdad, founded in 762 CE by the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur, that the synthesis of Persian and Arab worlds reached its first great apex. The city was laid out in grand concentric circles, symbolic of a new center of the world, one that drew resources, talent, and commerce from across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Baghdad's markets bustled with goods from Persia, India, Africa, and Byzantium. Its libraries housed texts in Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Arabic. Scholars, poets, mathematicians, and scientists gathered in its academies, forging an intellectual renaissance unmatched in human history. The Persian contribution to this blossoming civilization was profound. Persian thinkers translated Greek philosophy into Arabic, preserving and expanding upon the scientific traditions of antiquity. Persian poets began to shape a new literary language. Initially, Arabic was the dominant vehicle for high culture, law, and theology. Yet over time, a distinctive Persian Islamic synthesis emerged in which Persian language and poetic expression reasserted their brilliance within an Islamic context. Among the most celebrated of these Persian voices was Radaki, whose verses in the 9th and 10th centuries laid the groundwork for a flourishing tradition of Persian poetry. He wrote not merely an imitation of Arab styles, but with a distinctly Iranian soul, weaving imagery from Persian landscapes, history, and spiritual insight into an Islamic framework. His work was a signpost of what was to come, a revival of Persian cultural identity within the broader Islamic world. Political authority in Persia also began to take new forms. The vast Abbasid Caliphate, for all its grandeur, struggled to maintain direct control over far-flung provinces. As central authority waned, local dynasties of Persian origin began to emerge, governors first, then independent rulers. In Khorasan, the Tahirids governed in the name of the caliph, but exercised autonomy. In the southwest, the Saffarids carved a realm of their own. Later, the Samanids in Transoxana and Khorasan ushered in a renaissance of Persian art, literature, and governance. Under the Samanids, Persian once again became a language of court and culture alongside Arabic. By the 10th century, Persian culture had reasserted itself in every sphere of intellectual and artistic life. The great Persian epic poet Ferdowsi composed the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, a monumental poetic chronicle that resurrected the memory of Iran's pre-Islamic past, its heroes, kings, and mythic battles, in elegant, timeless verse. The Shahnameh was not merely literature. It was a cultural manifesto reaffirming Persian identity in a world transformed by Islam. In its massive narrative, the ancient kings of Persia walked again: Cyrus, Darius, Ardashir, Khosrow, forging a lineage of memory that defied centuries of upheaval. Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, also flourished in Persian lands. Figures like Al-Hallaj, Rumi, Adar, and Hafiz expressed the spiritual depths of Islam through a language rich with Persian metaphor, imagination, and emotional intensity. Their poems spoke of love, longing, the divine presence hidden in the ordinary, transforming Islamic spirituality into a universal art form that transcended boundaries of language and creed. Despite these cultural and spiritual triumphs, politics remained dynamic and often violent. Persia was no monolith under a central ruler during this era. Instead, it was a mosaic of smaller principalities, empires, and tribal confederations that rose and fell in rapid succession. The Buyids in the 10th century carved a realm in western Iran and Iraq, asserting Shura Islamic authority in opposition to Sunni caliphs. Later, the Seljuks, of Turkic origin but deeply Persianized in culture, established a powerful empire that, in the 11th and 12th centuries, dominated Iran and much of the Middle East, patronizing Persian art, architecture, and scholarship. In the 13th century, the storm of the Mongol conquests, led by Genghis Khan and later carried east and west by his descendants, brought devastation on a scale unparalleled in history. Cities were razed, populations decimated, and the old order shattered. Yet even this cataclysm could not erase Persian culture. In the chaos of ruin, new Persianate polities arose. Among them the Ilkhanids, a Mongol regime that adopted Islam and became patrons of Persian art, literature, and architecture, once again blending cultures in that indestructible Persian way. The 14th century saw the rise of Timur Tamerlane, whose conquests spanned from Anatolia to India. Timur himself embraced Persian court culture, even as his campaigns laid waste to vast regions. In Samarkand, he constructed madrasas and mosques that blended Turkic, Mongol, and Persian motifs. The Persian language and cultural aesthetics became the lingua franca of elite culture across a region stretching from the Ottoman domains to the Delhi Sultanate. Through conquest and assimilation, demographic shifts, and empire building, Persian identity proved its enduring adaptability. The spirit of the plateau, born of rugged geography and millennia of synthesis and resistance, flowed into every corner of the Islamic world. Persian literature, philosophy, science, and art became central to the intellectual life of Islam. Administrators trained in Persian governance shaped courts from Baghdad to Delhi. Poets wrote of love, divinity, and kings with a voice at once intimate and universal. By the time the gunpowder empires arose, the Safavids in Iran, the Ottomans in Turkey, and the Mughals in India, Persian cultural influence was foundational across this interconnected world. Under the Safavids, Persia would re-emerge as a unified state once more, this time as a Shura Islamic kingdom with a distinct national identity, restoring Persian language, rituals, and aesthetics to central place in political life. This renaissance was rooted in the long centuries of cultural resilience that had begun in the fire temples and palaces of ancient Persia and continued through the Islamic Golden Age. The story of Iran's transformation in the Islamic era is not a tale of erasure, but one of integration, adaptation, and renewal, where ancient traditions were not replaced wholesale, but reinterpreted within new frameworks, allowing Persian identity to thrive even amid seismic change. From the deserts of Arabia to the thriving cosmopolitan centers of the Islamic world, from the courts of Baghdad to the libraries of Samarkand, Persian culture became both a foundational pillar and an enduring voice in the evolving narrative of civilization itself. The entire Near East quaked in transformation through the 14th and 15th centuries. The Mongol invasions had shaken civilization to its core, demolishing cities, scattering populations, and dissolving old political orders. Yet out of the dust of these upheavals, new forces stirred. The land of Persia, battered and fragmented, had endured centuries of syncretism, resilience, and reinvention. Muslim, Turkic, Mongol, and Persian traditions intertwined, shaping a cultural tapestry stronger for its complexity. But in the early 16th century, a new force arose that would change Iran and the region forever. This force was the Safavid dynasty, born of a Sufi religious order that traced its origins to the 12th century. Though mystical in its early identity, over time the Safavid order became a political movement. By the turn of the 16th century, its leaders had cultivated a loyal following among Turkmen tribes whose warrior ethos was as fierce as their devotion. The most transformative figure among them was Shah Ismail, a charismatic leader, fierce warrior, and polymath whose vision extended far beyond the ambitions of mere tribal chieftains. Born into the lineage of Safavid peers, spiritual leaders, Ismail had inherited not only leadership, but a profound religious conviction rooted in an esoteric form of Shura Islam. At its core was the idea that the Imam, the rightful spiritual authority, held divine guidance. This belief resonated deeply among followers who saw in Ismail not just a ruler, but a spiritual champion destined to reshape the world. In 1501, at just 19 years old, Ismail proclaimed himself Shah of Iran in the ancient city of Tabriz. His proclamation was more than a declaration of kingship. It was a spiritual awakening. He declared Twelver Shura Islam the state religion, a historic turning point that would define Iranian identity for centuries. Previously, most of the Muslim world, including Sunni empires like the Ottomans and the Mughals, adhered to the Sunni tradition. Iran now stood alone, a Shura realm anchored in the belief that the infallible line of imams descended from the Prophet Muhammad through his cousin and son-in-law Ali held legitimate authority. The decision was radical, not merely in doctrine, but in political consequence. It forged Iran into a unique polity, not simply an Islamic state, but a Shurite empire with a distinct religious identity that separated it from both its Sunni neighbors and the broader Sunni-dominated Islamic world. This identity would remain central to Persian politics, culture, and society, even through future upheavals. Yet the road to consolidation was most assuredly not peaceful. Shah Ismail spent the early years of his reign confronting internal rebellions, regional warlords, and rival factions that sought independence in the fractured aftermath of Mongol and Timurid decline. His most formidable external rival emerged to the west across the plains of Anatolia, the mighty Ottoman Empire, led by Sultan Selim I. The Ottomans, Sunni champions with a highly disciplined army and formidable artillery, saw in Safavid Shurism not only a religious schism, but a political threat. In 1514, at the Battle of Calderon, the clash between Shah Ismail and Sultan Selim became inevitable. The battlefield was a stark plateau near the Tigris River, and the armies faced one another with fierce resolve. The Safavid cavalry, famed for its valor, charged with thunderous momentum, yet the Ottomans possessed a new instrument of war: gunpowder weapons and cannons. These weapons tore into the charging horsemen with devastating effect. The Persian cavalry faltered under the barrage. The Ottomans emerged victorious. Ismail himself narrowly escaped capture, fleeing the field and retreating back into his territories with his army diminished. The defeat at Calderon was a psychological blow as much as a military one. For the first time, the aura of Shah Ismail's invincibility shattered. Yet the long-term consequences were paradoxically transformative. The Safavid state, though bruised, endured. It now recognized the necessity of integrating modern military technology and organized administration, going beyond reliance on tribal levies and spiritual zeal alone. Ismail's successors, notably Shah Tahmasp I, began the complex task of consolidating the Safavid realm. They employed Persian bureaucrats, expanded bureaucratic institutions, and engaged in diplomatic relations with European powers who saw in Shura Iran a potential counterweight to Ottoman domination. Europe was entering its own age of transformation, the Renaissance, and Persian courts and European monarchs exchanged envoys, poets, craftsmen, and merchants, weaving threads of connection across continents. Persian culture flourished during this era. Under the Safavids, Persian literature, miniature painting, architecture, and poetry reached extraordinary heights. The city of Isfahan, transformed under Shah Abbas I, who reigned from 1588 to 1629, became one of the most magnificent capitals the world had ever seen. Shah Abbas moved the capital there deliberately, envisioning a center that would reflect Persia's imperial grandeur and cultural sophistication. The bridges, gardens, and mosques of Isfahan showcased an architectural language that fused Persian aesthetic principles with monumental scale and intricate ornamentation. The Sham Mosque, with its sweeping domes, azure tiles, and majestic courtyard, became a symbol not merely of political power, but of a spiritual and artistic renaissance. Its inscriptions and geometric symmetry invited reflection on beauty, unity, and divine order. Under Shah Abbas's leadership, the Safavid state also reformed the military and administrative apparatus. He built a standing army modeled in part on Ottoman organization, but rooted in Persian loyalty. He curtailed the power of unruly Kizilbash tribal factions, replacing them with a core of ghulams, trained troops often drawn from converted Christian youths who had been raised in Persian courts. This professional military, disciplined and loyal to the Shah alone, became the backbone of a more centralized and stable state. Trade routes crisscrossed the empire, linking Persia to India, Central Asia, the Ottoman world, and the heart of Europe. Persian silk, carpets of exquisite design, metalwork, and ceramics circulated widely, prized for their craftsmanship and style. Persian carpets, in particular, evolved beyond utilitarian floor coverings into works of art with symbolic imagery, layered patterns, and meticulous detail. These carpets came to symbolize Persian craftsmanship across the world, prestigious, durable, and deeply nuanced in design. Yet the Safavid era was never static. It was defined by a constant interplay of rivalry and collaboration, conflict and creativity. The frontier with the Ottoman Empire remained a zone of tension. Pitched battles, raids, and shifting alliances marked centuries of intermittent warfare. Persia's eastern borders, too, faced pressure from Uzbek khanates and nomadic incursions from Central Asia. Diplomacy, war, marriages, and trade all played parts in an intricate game of geopolitical chess that stretched from the Caucasus to the Indus. Religiously, Shurism became deeply embedded in the fabric of Persian society. Sacred sites, rituals, and commemorations of the imams, especially the martyrdom of Imam Hussein at Karbala, became central to communal life. Processions, poetry recitations, and rituals of mourning knit together communities across class and region. The clerical establishment, now a distinct and powerful institution, played a role that went beyond spiritual guidance into education, jurisprudence, and social organization. A new religious scholarly class, the ulama, influenced legal codes, moral expectations, and communal life in profound ways. In villages and cities alike, mosques, schools, madrasas, and shrines became centers of social cohesion. Pilgrimage routes radiated outward, connecting Pars, Azerbaijan, Khorasan, and beyond to Karbala and Najaf. Shura theology, once contested and persecuted in many parts of the Islamic world, was now at the center of Persia's identity, shaping art, law, culture, and diplomacy. Yet even as the Safavid state crystallized Persia's identity as a Shura kingdom, it remained part of a broader, interconnected world. Persian scholars translated Greek, Arabic, and Turkish works into Persian. Persian poets composed masterpieces that echoed through courts from Bokhara to Delhi. Merchants carried Persian goods across caravan routes that bridged east and west. This age produced towering figures in Persian literature, such as Sa'di and Hafez, whose poems spoke of love and divine longing with a depth that transcended geography and era. Their verses were not courtly ornamentation, but expressions of human experience, longing for the beloved, lamenting injustice, celebrating the beauty of nature, and probing the mysteries of existence. Hafez's ghazals, in particular, became woven into the cultural fabric of Persian life, recited at gatherings, memorized by students, and interpreted as mirrors of spiritual insight. As the 17th century progressed, Persia remained vibrant, but also increasingly entangled in the geopolitics of empires. The rising power of Russia to the north, the consolidation of the Ottoman state to the west, and the expanding influence of European maritime powers all exerted pressure on Persian diplomacy and defense. Trade that once traversed overland routes began to shift toward maritime pathways, with Portuguese, Dutch, and English ships seeking footholds in the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and the Arabian Sea. This confluence of forces presented both challenges and opportunities. Persian ports, such as Bandar Abbas, became hubs of commerce and cultural exchange. Diplomats courted European monarchs for alliances against common rivals. Merchants from Portugal, England, and the Netherlands established trading posts, bringing new goods, firearms, and ideas, while exporting Persian silk, pearls, coffee, and carpets. The Safavid Empire, however, would eventually feel the strain of internal conflict, succession disputes, and economic pressure. By the late 17th century, the dynasty that had once unified Persia was weakening, fracturing along factional lines, and increasingly unable to project authority across distant provinces. The grandeur of Isfahan's minarets and domes endured, but the currents of history were shifting once again. In the corridors of the Ottoman Sublime Porte, in the courts of the Mughal emperors of India, and in the merchant halls of European trading companies, Persia was both respected and viewed as vulnerable. The political landscape that the Safavids had so meticulously cultivated was showing cracks, not because of a single catastrophe, but through the slow drift of demographic change, economic reorientation, and military pressure. And yet, even as the Safavid state waned, the legacy of its transformation endured. Shura-e-Islam remained central to Persian identity. Artistic traditions continued to flourish, and the Persian language, resilient as ever, held firm as a vehicle of poetry, governance, and scholarship across Asia. This cultural endurance ensured that Persia, though facing cycles of rise and decline, remained a civilization of profound influence. The next chapter in Iranian history, the arrival of new powers, fresh conflicts with Russia and the Ottomans, internal reform movements, and the eventual emergence of modern nationhood, would unfold amid the legacy of centuries of synthesis. Ancient kings and poets, fire temples and mosques, conquest and culture woven into a timeless tapestry. But that story, rich and expansive, beckons from just beyond the horizon, and it is one we will continue with the next part of this narrative. The sun that once bathed the great domes of Isfahan and echoed through the corridors of Safavid power had long set on the glory of that dynasty. The echo of prayer calls and poetry still resonated in mosques and tea houses, but the political might of the Safavids was fading. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, Persia found itself adrift amid rising European powers, resurgent neighbors, and internal fractures that no army or palace could easily mend. The state that had defined Iran as a Shura, stronghold, and cultural beacon now faced a different challenge. Survival in a world increasingly interconnected yet dominated by empires armed with new technology and expansionist ambition. By the late 1600s, Safavid authority had weakened under the combined weight of factional rivalries, economic pressures, and the shifting tides of trade. Overland commerce that had once flowed across the Silk Road was increasingly being eclipsed by maritime routes controlled by Europeans. Portuguese carracks in the Indian Ocean, Dutch and English ships in the Persian Gulf. Wealth that once funneled through Persian cities like Isfahan and Shiraz now found its way to ports such as Surat, Goa, and later Bombay, bypassing the traditional arteries of the Iranian interior. The old networks of caravanserais and merchant guilds lost their primacy, and a new economic order emerged, one shaped by naval power and colonial reach. Amid this changing world, the Safavid state struggled to adapt. Weaker central authority struggled to contain tribal unrest in its eastern provinces. Kurdish, Baluchi, and Afghan tribes, long autonomous and resilient, seized the opportunity to push against declining tax revenues and weak garrisons. The final blow came not from the west or the north, but from within. In 1722, Afghan forces under Mahmud Hataki marched on Isfahan. After a brutal siege, the city fell, a symbol that Persia's centuries-old political center could no longer withstand calculated force. The Safavid dynasty collapsed, and Persia entered a period of fragmentation and instability. In the ensuing decades, several regional powers vied for dominance. Among them was Nader Shah Afshar, a military commander of extraordinary talent and ferocity. Rising from the turbulence of tribal warlords and warring factions, Nader Shah carved out a new realm. His campaigns were astonishing in scope. He reconquered lost territories, marched into Central Asia, and in 1739 sacked Delhi, capturing immense wealth and returning to Persia with spoils that stunned the world. including the famed Peacock Throne and a portion of the Koh-i-Noor Diamond. For a brief moment, Persia's martial power surged once more to the forefront of Asian geopolitics. Yet Nader Shah's genius was matched only by his ruthlessness. His reign was marked by brutality and paranoia, and after his assassination in 1747, Persia again fragmented. Regional dynasties emerged. The Zands in the south under Karim Khan, who chose to rule with relative moderation and focus on rebuilding civic life. And later, the Qajars in the north, whose tribal confederation would ultimately seize control of the fragmented lands. By the late 18th century, the Qajar dynasty had emerged as Persia's new ruling house. In 1794, Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar consolidated power and established Tehran as his capital, a modest town strategically positioned between the Caspian and the Zagros, equally distant from tribal strongholds and historic capitals. The choice was deliberate. Tehran was not ancient like Persepolis or Isfahan, but it was defensible and served as a fresh base from which the Qajars could assert authority over a fractured land. However, the Qajar era would be defined less by victories and more by losses and negotiations with imperial powers emerging from Europe. The Russian Empire, driven by expansionist ambitions and access to the Caspian, pressed southward. The British Empire, seeking influence over India and maritime dominance in the Persian Gulf, sought to shape Persia's policies and trade. Persia, weakened by decades of internal turmoil and lacking modern military technology, found itself ill-prepared to resist these pressures. By the early 19th century, the Qajars faced a formidable Russian advance in the Caucasus. In a series of wars from 1804 to 1813 and again from 1826 to 1828, Russian armies pushed into Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani territories that Persia had long regarded as integral parts of its realm. The result was a string of humiliating treaties. The Treaty of Gulistan in 1813 and the Treaty of Turkmenchay in 1828. Persia ceded vast swaths of territory in the Caucasus, now parts of modern Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and agreed to pay indemnities that strained its treasury. Most damaging of all was the erosion of sovereignty. Persia was compelled to grant extraterritorial rights to Russian subjects, undermining its legal authority even within its own borders. These losses reshaped Iranian consciousness. For centuries, Persia had been one of the great powers of Asia. Its armies feared, its culture admired. Now it was struggling to contain foreign intrusion in its own backyard. The Qajar Shahs responded through a combination of diplomacy, inertia, and sporadic efforts at reform. But reform was difficult in a society where tribal power, court intrigue, and fiscal weakness all undercut centralized authority. By the late 19th century, Persian elites and intellectuals began to articulate a powerful critique of the status quo. Modern ideas, nationalism, constitutionalism, civil rights, carried by travelers, students returning from abroad, and Persian intellectuals exposed to European thought began to circulate in Tehran, Tabriz, Shiraz, and Isfahan. The vision of a constitutional government, accountable to the people rather than personal autocracy, took hold among educated classes. This ferment culminated in the Persian constitutional revolution of 1905 to 1911, a seismic political upheaval that would reshape not only Persian governance, but the very idea of political legitimacy in Iran. Mass demonstrations erupted across the country, demanding an end to arbitrary rule, legal protections, and a representative assembly, Majlis, whose authority could check royal power. Merchants, religious leaders, students, and workers all participated, driven by shared grievances, corruption, economic hardship, and the humiliation of foreign dominance. In 1906, under popular pressure, Mozaffar al-Din Shah Qajar signed a decree establishing a constitution and a national assembly, the Majlis. For the first time in Iran's long history, subjects were no longer merely ruled. They were beginning to participate in governance. Newspapers multiplied, ideas flourished, and a sense of national identity infused public discourse. Yet the road was rocky. The Qajar court resisted limitations on royal prerogative. Britain and Russia, wary of nationalist movements that might undermine their influence, intervened politically. In 1907, the Anglo-Russian Convention effectively partitioned Persia into spheres of influence. The north under Russian dominance, the south under British influence, and a neutral zone in between. This blatant carving up of Iranian sovereignty ignited nationalist resentment and highlighted the fragility of the new constitutional order in the face of imperial power. World War I erupted in 1914, and Persia, though formally neutral, became a theater of conflict. Russian, British, and Ottoman forces marched across its territory. Towns were occupied, supply lines disrupted, and famine and disease spread. The power of the central government weakened further. In 1917, the Russian Revolution removed one imperial player from Persia's geopolitical stage, but unleashed new uncertainties as Bolshevik rhetoric challenged imperialism across Eurasia. Amid the chaos of war and foreign occupation, a new figure emerged who would reshape Persia's political trajectory. Reza Khan, a bold military officer of modest origin, rose through the ranks of the Cossack Brigade, an elite military unit originally trained by Russian officers. In 1921, Reza Khan led a coup that captured Tehran, effectively displacing the weakened Qajar government. Within 3 years, he had consolidated power and maneuvered to become Reza Shah Pahlavi, establishing a new dynasty and marking the beginning of modern Iranian statehood. Reza Shah was a modernizer with a clear vision to transform Persia into a strong, centralized, secular nation-state. Inspired by the rapid modernization of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, he embarked on sweeping reforms. He built railroads connecting Tehran to the Caspian and Persian Gulf, constructed modern schools, reformed the legal system, and sought to reduce the power of tribal leaders and religious institutions. His ambition was national unity and independence, an Iran that could stand on equal footing with the great powers of the age. Yet modernization came with costs. Reza Shah's reforms were authoritarian. Political dissent was suppressed, and religious leaders who opposed his secularization policies found themselves marginalized or exiled. Women's rights were advanced on paper, including the controversial ban on the veiling of women, but at the expense of traditional social structures that many rural communities still held dear. The tension between modernity and tradition became one of the defining conflicts of early 20th century Iran. On the international stage, Persia's strategic position, oil-rich, bordering the Soviet Union, close to British India, drew renewed foreign interest. In 1908, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later British Petroleum, discovered vast oil reserves in southwestern Persia near Masjid Soliman. The discovery transformed global politics. Oil, black gold, was swiftly recognized as the energy resource of the modern age. Britain, in particular, sought to secure access to Iranian oil, vital for fueling naval fleets and industrial machinery. The Iranian state's relationship with oil became fraught. Concessions granted to foreign companies enriched company shareholders and colonial powers, but delivered limited benefits to the Iranian treasury and people. Nationalist outcry grew. Iran's wealth, generated beneath its soil, flowed outward while its people struggled with poverty, inequity, and intrusive foreign influence. The discovery of oil also transformed Iran's geopolitical significance. In World War II, Iran's oil fields, strategic rail lines, and proximity to the Soviet Union made it a theater of great power competition. In 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran to secure supply routes and deny Nazi Germany access to Iranian infrastructure. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The young Shah's reign would be shaped by the pressures of Cold War geopolitics, national development ambitions, and growing societal divisions. The post-war years brought both hope and tension. Political parties emerged. Debates about land reform and oil nationalization occupied the majlis, and popular leaders like Mohammad Mossadegh rose to prominence with a powerful nationalist message. that Iran must control its own oil and chart its own destiny free from foreign domination. In 1951, Mossadegh was appointed prime minister and moved to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The outcry in Britain and the United States was swift, leading to economic embargoes, covert actions, and eventually the dramatic 1953 coup in which Mossadegh was overthrown with covert support from British and American intelligence. This coup left deep scars in the Iranian psyche. It symbolized foreign intervention and the fragility of democratic aspirations. Mohammad Reza Shah, restored to power, increasingly ruled with authoritarian flair, relying on a powerful internal security apparatus, the SAVAK, to suppress dissent. The monarchy's emphasis on rapid modernization, Western alignment, and centralized authority generated both progress and resentment. By the late 1970s, when this story arcs toward the dawn of another revolution, Iran stood at a crossroads, a nation of deep historical roots, from ancient empires, fire temples, and poetry, now immersed in the rhythms of oil revenues, Cold War geopolitics, and a society grappling with questions of identity, sovereignty, modernity, and justice. The last decades of the 20th century in Iran were a crescendo of history, the culmination of centuries of culture, power struggles, foreign influence, and internal contradictions that had been building for generations. The son of the man who had risen from a cavalry officer to a monarch, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, stood as both the embodiment of Iran's aspirations for modernization and, to many inside his own country, the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Under his rule, sprawling highways cut through deserts and mountains. Oil revenues funded grand palaces and ambitious development projects, and the state pursued a vision of rapid secularization and Western-style progress. Four parts of the population, urban elites, technocrats, and bureaucrats. This was an era of new opportunity. For others, rural villagers, religious scholars, merchants, workers, it felt like an imposed revolution from above, alien to tradition and dismissive of local identity. The Pahlavi state prided itself on its reforms, changes to land ownership, expansion of education, infrastructure development, and the controversial white revolution that promoted women's suffrage, industrial growth, and cultural alignment with the West. Yet these reforms were also part of the problem. They were implemented quickly, often without consultation, and frequently at the expense of traditional structures that had sustained rural communities and religious networks for centuries. Deepening income inequality, resentment toward corruption within the royal court, and the perception that Iranian sovereignty was compromised by close alignment with the United States and Britain fed a growing sense of grievance. Political dissent was not tolerated. The Shah's internal security service, SAVAK, operated with near unchecked power, arresting intellectuals, censoring media, suppressing religious figures, and intimidating activists. Fear and resentment built not only in the streets of Tehran, but in the bazaars of Qom, the lecture halls of Shiraz, and the mosques of Isfahan. A generation of educated youth sought meaning beyond Western-imported consumerism. A network of clerics and religious intellectuals found fertile ground for critique in the language not of tribal warlords, but of spiritual and moral renewal. At the center of this growing movement was one figure whose name would become synonymous with revolution, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Exiled during the 1960s for his outspoken denunciations of the Shah, Khomeini's voice reached Iranians far beyond his physical presence. From Najaf in Iraq and later from Paris, his sermons and tapes were smuggled into Iran, echoing in mosques, workshops, and living rooms. His message was simple yet enormously powerful. The Shah's rule was illegitimate. Western influence was corrosive, and only a government rooted in Islamic principles could truly represent the Iranian people. By 1978, the cries of protest that had once been sporadic eruptions had become a sustained wave across the country. Universities, bazaars, and religious centers became hubs of opposition. Strikes shut down industries. Massive demonstrations filled public squares. The sound of anti-government chants echoed through cities large and small. Streets became stages of collective outrage. and each act of repression by the regime only fueled further resistance. The turning point came in late 1978, when nationwide protests reached a scale that the Shah's security forces could no longer ignore. In some cities, tanks lined the boulevards. In others, clergy and students confronted riot police with prayer and unarmed courage. The revolution was not merely political, it was existential. It was a collision between two visions of Iran, one secular and Western aligned, the other grounded in religious legitimacy and self-determination. On January 16, 1979, the Shah, weakened by illness and losing control of his security apparatus, left Iran, officially for medical treatment, but in reality fleeing the storm that had become his nation. A few weeks later, on February 1st, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Tehran, greeted by millions of Iranians chanting Allahu Akbar and pledging allegiance to a new era. The Pahlavi dynasty, an institution that had dominated Iranian history for centuries, had collapsed with startling swiftness. The Islamic Republic was born amid fervor that mixed devotion, resentment, hope, and fear. What followed was a profound transformation of Iranian society. The revolution was not simply a change of rulers. It was a redefinition of political legitimacy. Power was now theorized as Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. The state was to be guided by a principle that fused religious authority with political sovereignty. New institutions were created, old elites were purged, and the symbols of Western influence, from alcohol sales to Western dress codes, were vociferously discouraged or banned. The early 1980s were marked by the revolutionary leadership's effort to translate ideology into governance, while navigating both domestic turmoil and regional conflict. Iran's revolution had inspired Islamist movements beyond its borders, a fact viewed with alarm by neighboring monarchies and secular governments. But few threats were more dangerous or immediate than the one that materialized on Iran's western frontier. In September 1980, Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran. Hussein, a secular Arab nationalist with close ties to Western military suppliers, miscalculated badly. He expected a swift victory over a nation he assumed was paralyzed by revolution. Instead, what followed was one of the longest and most brutal conflicts of the late 20th century, the Iran-Iraq War. For 8 years, from 1980 to 1988, Iran and Iraq fought a grinding, devastating war that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, ruined cities, and left scars on both societies that endure to this day. Trench warfare, missile barges, aerial bombardments, chemical weapons, all became tragically familiar across the border regions. Cities like Khorramshahr, Abadan, and Suzangurd witnessed some of the fiercest battles, where entire neighborhoods were destroyed and communities were displaced or annihilated. The war also became a crucible for the Iranian state to define its new identity. The leadership used religious symbolism to frame the conflict as sacred defense. Martyrdom, sacrifice, loyalty, and resistance became the cultural language of resilience. Young volunteers, many of them barely adults, joined the front lines with fervent zeal. Their names were recorded in memory books. Their sacrifices became part of the liturgical fabric of the post-revolutionary state. Economically, the war was ruinous. Oil exports, Iran's major source of revenue, were severely disrupted. Infrastructure was destroyed, foreign investment evaporated. The government mobilized every resource it could. Factories were repurposed to produce war materials, hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians, and families adjusted to shortages and rationing. The human toll extended far beyond the battlefield. Psychological trauma rippled through generations. At the same time, Iran's revolutionary government faced opposition from within. Not all Iranians embraced the new order. Leftist groups, nationalist factions, secular intellectuals, and Kurdish and Arab minorities resisted, sometimes violently. The revolution had not produced a monolith. It had ignited a complex interplay of competing visions for Iran's future. The leadership's response was often repressive, crackdowns, mass trials, and executions marked the early years of the Islamic Republic, leaving deep wounds and complex legacies of loss. By 1988, the conflict with Iraq ended inconclusively with a United Nations brokered ceasefire. Neither side had achieved decisive victory. Both had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. Cities lay in ruins. Economies were exhausted. Iran had emerged from the war territorially intact, but psychologically changed. A nation traumatized yet defiant, its revolutionary rhetoric hardened by years of existential struggle. The post-war era ushered in a new set of priorities for Iran's leaders: reconstruction, political consolidation, and navigating a world shaped by the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 removed a neighboring superpower and reshaped the geopolitical map of Eurasia. Meanwhile, the United States emerged as the dominant global force in the region, and Iran found itself increasingly at odds with American policy. In the 1990s, a generational shift began to occur within Iran. The children of the revolution, born amid slogans and wartime sacrifice, grew into adulthood with questions that their elders had not fully addressed. They had seen reconstruction, but also corruption, prosperity, but also stagnation, openness to the outside world, but also cultural restrictions. Universities expanded, satellite television and the early internet filtered into urban households, and a new sense of social consciousness took root. A key figure in this period was Muhammad Khatami, a reform-minded cleric elected president in 1997 with a landslide mandate, particularly among youth and women. Khatami campaigned on the promise of dialogue among civilizations, an ambitious idea that sought not confrontation, but conversation between Iran and the wider world. Under his leadership, civil society found space to expand. Newspapers flourished, cultural festivals grew bolder, and debates over political liberalization entered public discourse. Women pushed for greater rights. Artists pushed boundaries. Students pressed for academic freedom. Yet structural limits remained. The unelected institutions of the Islamic Republic, especially the Guardian Council and the Supreme Leadership, retained the power to veto legislation and disqualify candidates. Reformers faced both logistical obstacles and conservative backlash. Hardliners viewed reform as tantamount to capitulation to Western influence. Moderates saw resistance to change as the prison of national potential. Tensions between these factions shaped much of Iranian politics in the early 21st century. By the mid-2000s, a new chapter of authoritarian resurgence began with the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, whose populist rhetoric and confrontational style reinforced Iran's anti-Western posture. Ahmadinejad's tenure coincided with heightened tensions over Iran's nuclear program. Suspicions from the United States, Europe, and Israel grew that Iran's nuclear ambitions were not limited to peaceful energy programs, but extended toward weaponization. Tehran insisted its program was for electricity and scientific progress, but the international community responded with sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and near-constant geopolitical scrutiny. Sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union had devastating effects on Iran's economy. Foreign investment dried up. Inflation soared. Ordinary citizens struggled with shortages of medicine, technology, and capital. The government appealed to nationalist sentiment. Economic pressure was portrayed as a continuation of foreign hostility dating back to the 1953 coup and imperial interference. In this narrative, resistance was not merely political but existential, a defense of Iranian sovereignty against outside coercion. Yet the social toll of sanctions was real. Young Iranians, many well-educated and world-connected, faced limited job opportunities. Cultural expression was simultaneously expanding and constrained. Iranian cinema, music, and literature found international audiences, even as domestic censorship fluctuated between strict enforcement and occasional liberalization. Another watershed moment came with the 2009 presidential election, when reformist candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi appeared to garner widespread support. Millions of Iranians protested in the streets. waving green scarves as symbols of hope for change. The crackdown was swift and harsh. The movement was labeled by authorities as a foreign-backed disruption rather than a homegrown expression of civic frustration. The Green Movement marked a generational rupture, a moment when millions of Iranians publicly declared that the revolution's promises of dignity, justice, and freedom had yet to be fully realized. In the decade that followed, another shift occurred. A new generation of leaders, more pragmatic in tone, began to emerge. Hassan Rouhani, elected in 2013, campaigned on moderating Iran's international posture while seeking relief from crippling sanctions. In 2015, Iran reached a landmark agreement with major world powers, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, which promised sanctions relief in exchange for limits on Iran's nuclear program. For a moment, optimism spread. Foreign investment, diplomatic overtures, and economic resurgence seemed possible. But political divisions within Iran, changes in U.S. policy, and renewed tensions soon eroded that tenuous breakthrough. The global climate of polarization emboldened regional conflicts in Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon, and strategic competition with Saudi Arabia contributed to a sense that Iran was navigating a world at once interconnected and deeply divided. Through all of this, Iranian society changed in profound ways. Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, Mashhad, and Tabriz became sprawling modern metropolises connected by highways, telecommunications, and cultural networks that previous generations could scarcely imagine. Women pursued higher education in large numbers. Iranian scientists made breakthroughs in medicine, technology, and engineering. Literature and cinema won global recognition. Persian pop culture, music, film, and digital media intertwined with regional and global trends, creating a generational identity that was at once distinctly Iranian and unmistakably global. Throughout all of these transformations, one theme endured: the capacity of Iranian society to absorb, reinterpret, and persist. From ancient empires buffeted by cavalry and chariot to modern struggles over ideology, sovereignty, and identity, the people of Iran continued to shape their destiny, neither erased by conquest nor static in tradition. And yet, as the 21st century marches forward, Iran remains at a crossroads. The tensions between tradition and modernity, between religious authority and democratic aspirations, between regional ambition and global integration, are not mere political dilemmas. They are expressions of a civilization that has continually redefined itself across millennia. In the next part of this story, vast and deep as the history we've now traversed, we will explore Iran's role in a globalized world, its struggles and achievements in culture, science, diplomacy, and society in the early 21st century, bringing us to today and beyond. The 21st century dawned on Iran as both a period of extraordinary potential and profound challenge. Emerging from the shadow of the devastating 8-year Iran-Iraq War and the tumultuous post-revolutionary decades, the nation faced a world transformed by globalization, technology, and shifting geopolitical fault lines. Iranian society, now more urbanized and educated than ever before, wrestled with questions of identity, sovereignty, and modernization. From the bustling streets of Tehran to the ancient alleyways of Yazd, citizens navigated a complex reality, one in which tradition and modernity, ideology and pragmatism, religious authority and popular aspiration intersected in a dynamic, sometimes volatile dance. At the outset of the century, Iran's population was youthful, increasingly connected to global currents via satellite television, internet, and mobile communications. This digital awakening introduced Iranians to trends and ideas that transcended national borders. Music, film, literature, technology, and political discourse flowed with unprecedented speed. The internet became a new public square, offering spaces for debate, activism, and cultural exchange, even as the state sought to regulate content and suppress dissenting voices. Social media, in particular, empowered young Iranians to articulate their concerns, challenge authority, and mobilize support for causes ranging from environmental activism to social justice. Economic realities, however, tempered the excitement of technological and cultural modernization. Decades of international sanctions, compounded by domestic inefficiencies, constrained growth and created persistent inequalities. Oil, long the backbone of Iran's economy, was subject to global price fluctuations and political leverage, leaving ordinary citizens vulnerable to shifts they could not control. Inflation, unemployment, and limited access to foreign markets fueled frustration among urban youth, many of whom were well-educated yet unable to secure opportunities commensurate with their talents. Despite these challenges, a burgeoning private sector, small-scale startups, and entrepreneurial initiatives reflected a persistent resilience, illustrating the Iranian capacity to innovate under constraint. Politically, the early decades of the 21st century were a story of oscillation between reformist ambition and conservative retrenchment. The election of Mohammad Khatami in the late 1990s had sparked hopes for a liberalization of society and a rapprochement with the international community. Reformist movements flourished briefly, expanding press freedoms, allowing greater public debate, and encouraging civic engagement. Yet structural limits embedded in the Islamic Republic, particularly the supreme leader's unassailable authority, the Guardian Council's vetting of candidates, and the overarching ideological framework, constrained these efforts. By the mid-2000s, conservative factions had regained momentum, culminating in the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, whose confrontational posture both domestically and internationally reinforced the perception that Iran remained resistant to Western pressures, whether diplomatic or economic. A central axis of Iran's political landscape in this period revolved around its nuclear program. The international community, particularly the United States, Europe, and Israel, viewed Iran's uranium enrichment and technological advancements with deep suspicion. Tehran insisted its program was purely for peaceful purposes, including energy production and scientific research, but regional and global actors interpreted it through the prism of security threats. Negotiations, sanctions, and diplomatic brinkmanship became recurring features of Iran's foreign relations, illustrating the enduring tension between sovereignty, technological ambition, and international norms. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, momentarily suggested a pathway toward reconciliation. Sanctions were eased, investment flowed tentatively, and diplomatic dialogue appeared possible. For many Iranians, it represented a glimpse of the long-promised integration into the global economy. Yet domestic politics, international skepticism, and subsequent policy shifts in the United States demonstrated the fragility of such agreements. Iran's experience underscored a historical pattern. The nation's ambitions are frequently constrained or shaped by forces beyond its borders, a reflection of centuries of imperial interest, foreign intervention, and geopolitical rivalry. Socially and culturally, Iran has been a nation of remarkable continuity and creativity. Despite political and economic turbulence, Persian literature, cinema, music, and visual arts have flourished, both domestically and on the international stage. Iranian cinema, with auteurs such as Asghar Farhadi, received global acclaim, highlighting universal human experiences while remaining deeply rooted in Iranian society and sensibilities. Literature continued a rich tradition stretching back millennia, with modern novelists, poets, and essayists navigating themes of identity, history, and social change. Music, both traditional and contemporary, blended influences reflecting a society that was simultaneously globalized and distinctly Persian. Cultural resilience was mirrored by a commitment to education and science. Iran boasts a high literacy rate and has become a regional leader in areas such as medicine, engineering, and nanotechnology. Universities expanded rapidly, and a generation of scholars contributed to research and innovation despite resource constraints and political limitations. These achievements reflect a recurring historical theme, that Iran, in times of adversity, often channels its intellectual and creative energies into cultural and technological production, sustaining a sense of national pride and capability. Regional dynamics continued to define Iran's strategic environment. Its position as a major Shiite majority power in a predominantly Sunni Middle East gave it both influence and contention. Iran's involvement in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen reflected a complex strategy of protecting national interests, supporting allied groups, and projecting power in an unstable region. These interventions, while often framed as defensive or protective, were also controversial, provoking opposition from regional rivals and Western powers. The interplay of ideology, security concerns, and historical rivalries shaped much of Iran's foreign policy, illustrating the enduring tension between sovereignty, security, and international legitimacy. Internally, the society has faced a constant negotiation between religious authority and civic aspiration. Women's rights, freedom of expression, political participation, and social liberties remain contentious areas. While legal and institutional frameworks provide for certain rights, cultural and political enforcement often constrains them. Yet women's educational attainment, professional engagement, and activism demonstrate a gradual, persistent expansion of agency, reflecting both demographic realities and long-standing social currents. Environmental concerns have emerged as another defining factor in contemporary Iran. Water scarcity, desertification, and air pollution challenge both urban and rural communities. The drying of rivers, depletion of aquifers, and ecological stress in agricultural regions have created local crises, necessitating both technological solutions and policy reforms. These issues illustrate the intersection of natural resources, governance, and long-term sustainability, themes that have historically shaped Persian civilization from ancient irrigation networks to modern industrialization. Throughout these developments, Iran's historical consciousness has remained strong. Citizens and leaders alike draw on a millennia-long narrative of empire, conquest, cultural flourishing, and resilience. National identity is intertwined with language, literature, and shared memory, providing a framework for understanding contemporary challenges. The reverence for history is evident in the preservation of ancient sites, the commemoration of national heroes, and the integration of historical lessons into educational curricula and civic discourse. By the 2020s, Iran stands as a complex, multifaceted nation, a blend of ancient tradition and contemporary ambition, religious governance and civic aspiration, regional influence, and international contestation. Its cities pulse with life, its universities generate knowledge, and its culture resonates globally. At the same time, structural political constraints, economic pressures, and international isolation pose significant challenges. Iran's society remains engaged in an ongoing negotiation between the legacies of the past and the promises of the future, between ideology and pragmatism, between local priorities and global realities. The story of Iran in this final part of our historical narrative is not simply about political regimes or wars, though they have been significant. It is about continuity, adaptation, and resilience. From the ancient empires that shaped the Near East, through the dynasties that ruled from Isfahan to Tehran, through revolution, war, and reconstruction, Iran has endured as a civilization that continually negotiates the tension between change and continuity. Its people, their creativity, intellectual ambition, and resilience have been the through line of this narrative, sustaining the nation's identity through the tumult of history. Iran today, standing at the intersection of history and modernity, embodies both the promise and the challenge of the Persian legacy. Its story is one of survival, transformation, and adaptation, a testament to a civilization that has weathered conquest, internal upheaval, and global pressures while continuing to define itself on its own terms. The narrative of Iran is unfinished, yet it is rich with lessons from the past, insights into human society, and inspiration for the future. It demonstrates the power of culture, the persistence of identity, and the enduring quest for sovereignty and self-determination. As the sun sets over the Zagros Mountains and reflects off the domes of Tehran and Isfahan, the story of Iran remains one of profound continuity amid change. It is the story of a people who have endured centuries of challenges, absorbed foreign influences, and yet retained a distinct cultural and national identity. From the empires of antiquity to the modern Islamic Republic, Iran's history is a living chronicle of adaptation, resistance, and aspiration. In every generation, Iranians have balanced the tension between the past and the future, between tradition and innovation, and between the local and the global. This is the enduring story of Iran, complex, resilient, and ever-evolving. The journey of the Iranian nation, from the earliest civilizations of Elam, through the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian empires, through the rise and fall of dynasties, the trauma of invasion, the flowering of culture, and the political upheavals of the 20th and 21st centuries, reveals a civilization uniquely capable of renewal. Despite external pressures and internal divisions, the Iranian people continue to assert their agency, shape their society, and preserve their heritage. Today, as ever, the story of Iran is not only about political or military power. It is about culture, intellect, creativity, and the human capacity for resilience. It is a story of a nation that, while profoundly aware of its history, continues to write its future. The final lesson is clear. Civilizations endure not merely through conquest or wealth, but through the transmission of knowledge, the preservation of culture, and the adaptability of their people. Iran exemplifies this principle. From the grandeur of Persepolis to the resilience of modern Tehran, from the philosophical debates of medieval scholars to the civic and artistic engagement of contemporary youth, Iran's history is a testament to human endurance, creativity, and continuity. Its people have learned that survival is not enough. Survival must be accompanied by renewal, learning, and the ongoing cultivation of identity and purpose. As the 21st century progresses, Iran remains a nation at the crossroads of tradition and modernity, isolation and globalization, ideology and pragmatism. Its future will be shaped by the decisions of its leaders, the engagement of its citizens, and the pressures and opportunities presented by an interconnected world. Yet one constant remains: the enduring spirit of a people whose culture, history, and resilience have defined them for millennia and continue to do so today. Iran, in all its complexity and contradiction, stands as a testament to the enduring power of human civilization, a civilization that looks to the past to understand the present and to the future with cautious hope and steadfast determination.